Welcome everyone to this session of the Weatherhead Forum. Very happy to have you with us. I'm Ted Gilman, Executive Director of the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs, and I will be moderating today's event. The Weatherhead Forum showcases the research and debates of the various units and affiliates of the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. This year in the forum, we're also hosting some special sessions on big topics, such as this extremely timely session. Our topic today is empathy and xenophobia, migrant and refugee experiences. And it is my great pleasure to introduce our panelists, and I'm going to keep these introductions short because we have 4 panelists and I want to devote as much time as possible to them. First, we have Jackie Bhabha. Jackie is a professor of the practice of health and human rights in the Department of Global Health and Population. She is also Director of Research at the François-Xavier Bagnoud Center for Health and Human Rights at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Finally, she is Jeremiah Smith Jr. Lecturer on Law at the Harvard Law School. Second, we have Sarah Dryden-Peterson. Sarah is an Associate Professor of Education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Third, we have Melani Cammett. Melani is the Director of the Weatherhead Center and the Clarence Dillon Professor of International Affairs in the Department of Government at Harvard University, as well as a professor in the Department of Global Health and Population at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Our final panelist is having a bit of trouble joining us, but it is Rula Amin. Rula is the Senior Communication Advisor and Spokesperson for the Regional Bureau for the Middle East and North Africa at UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency. So together, they will approach our topic of migration and refugees from a variety of disciplines, research areas, and perspectives, and I look forward to this conversation very much. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Jackie. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ted. Thank you very much to all my colleagues at the Weatherhead Center. Thank you for organizing a very important discussion, which I'm delighted to be part of. So I am going to start off by presenting some new work that is urging a change of direction for migration scholarship from an exclusive focus on migrants, migrant behaviors, migrant problems, migrant challenges, to a focus that also includes the issues facing host communities. And I hope to persuade you of why I think this is important. So to start off with, I think we need to recognize that the days when most forced international migration occurred across well-charted and predictable routes between officially designated crossing points, those days are over. Increasingly, access to legal and safe mobility is the elusive province of lucky people, people who have privilege and power, and millions who desperately need protection and security do not have access to such safe routes. Instead, they're people who are fleeing war, violence, climate-related disaster, and other threats, routinely lack the humanitarian assistance they need and are forced to resort to tortuous, improvised itineraries, which often expose them to serious, life-threatening risk. But these itineraries also bring them face to face with frontline host populations who are ill-equipped to receive and sustain them. These are not the traditional border posts. These are not the traditional megacities. These are frontline areas which do not have the preparation they need for these populations. And yet, despite their lack of preparation, time and again, these frontline hosts rise to the humanitarian challenge, displaying remarkable generosity and openness of spirit, despite the disruption to their quotidian routine and the lack of institutional support. So I want to suggest that this pervasive aspect of frontline host behavior, which I'm going to call empathic solidarity, is both critical and fragile. Much current state policy undermines and destroys this solidarity instead of sustaining and supporting it. So I would argue it's not some inherent xenophobia latent in frontline communities that emerges inevitably. Rather, xenophobia and hostility are predictable reactions to the failure of state policy to support and preempt the needs of frontline communities. But let me just step back for a second and talk a little bit about what I mean by this slightly cumbersome term, empathic solidarity, which is not a term that it's in common usage. So by solidarity, I understand solidarity to mean a politically driven engagement with an other, towards whom different sorts of support might be extended: emotional support, material support, strategic or political support. So classic examples of solidarity are boycotts of products, South African Granny Smiths, Californian grapes, blood diamonds, associated with exploitation and injustice, a political response. And much humanitarian work is driven by this motivation, be it the acts of first responders to disasters or the financial contributions that fuel these interventions. Those exhibiting solidarity don't have a personal direct link to the situation they engage in. Rather, they have an ideological or political or maybe religious commitment. The floods of humanitarians, for example, on the Greek islands from 2015 onwards, exemplify this behavior. But the empathic solidarity that I'm talking about is something else. And let me distinguish it from two other terms in common usage briefly. Firstly, the term sympathy. By sympathy, I understand an expression of emotion directed at acknowledging rather than addressing human suffering, feeling for someone rather than feeling with them or doing something. So some people also use the term compassion for that type of behavior. That's not what I'm thinking of. Secondly, charity. Charity might be the outcome of a pro-social norm, a religious or ethical duty encouraged by someone's environment. And it gives a kind of warm glow. But I think often charity comes from a position of socioeconomic superiority, a sense of obligation, a kind of de haut en bas, gracious way of dealing with inequity and trying to reduce it. Whatever the intention of this charity, I think it often is associated with some sort of objective arrogance. So there's a lot of interesting social science research which suggests that this kind of charity is inversely related. There's an inverse relationship between this kind of charity and the actual relationship of power to the community. And in the migration context, I think we can relate this notion of charity to the increasing behavior of rich global north states giving money to keep migrant populations, forced migrant populations, including refugees, in their spaces and to help their development, so-called migration development nexus, which some people also say is a way of containing migration. You give people money to stay in Jordan, you give people money to stay in Lebanon, you give people money to stay maybe even in Greece to keep them out of your own country. So it's a way of externalizing this responsibility. So my concern in focusing on empathic solidarity is to argue that this dramatic phenomenon that we see again and again world over is dramatically neglected and dramatically unsupported. And that the predictable needs of the frontline hosts who evidence this behavior are ignored and do not feature centrally in our policymaking. So who are these host communities? The host communities that I'm thinking of are people who are newly rendered frontlines or hotspots. Many of them become engaged in unanticipated transformative acts of solidarity towards strangers who arrive uninvited in their territory. And the solidarity can, of course, for them, produce a sense of moral well-being, a kind of feeling of expressing a common humanity. But of course, for the migrants, it also is critical because it transforms what is a traumatic experience into a less traumatic experience. It can change the feeling of being completely excluded to being part of a human embrace. So it is critical behavior. Now, of course, I don't want to suggest that all frontline communities behave like this. Overt acts of racial hatred, of course, unfortunately quite common and very visible. But I'd suggest that they are not the norm. They are not the majority. And indeed, if you think of some of the most visible cases of this expression of xenophobic hatred at the border, they are noticeable precisely because they are, in a way, the exception or the minority. So if you think, for example, of the behavior of Hungarian groups at the EU's eastern borders, it was memorable, I think, to many of us, partly because it contrasted with the behavior of Greeks running to the shore, or Germans and Austrians and Italians rushing to the stations with bottles of water and toys for children. If you think of the response to Afghans today here in the US, again, you see this outpouring of what I would call empathic solidarity, just coming from ordinary people, not professional humanitarians. So these key players, these frontline hosts, I think, critically need support for two reasons. One, I've already explained, is because I think they transform a potentially traumatic experience of migrants into a livable experience. Being invited into someone's home and given a warm meal, being transported to a camp where you, instead of having to trudge there, being given a bottle of water, being given warm clothes, are transformative experiences, not just materially, but emotionally. But secondly, and at least as important, the support of frontline communities has the potential to impact government policy. It can preempt xenophobic developments in national government, and on the contrary, use personal experience to drive a more inclusive and accepting and generous policy. So if frontline communities have the support they need to enable generosity to be sustained, they also have the capacity to then say to their governments, we know what it's like having immigrants or migrants or refugees in our community, and we value it, and it has enhanced our life and not harmed our life. And I think, and this is really my final point, I think that government policy manifestly fails to do this. And I think it fails to do this not by neglect, but by intent. These needs are predictable. Migration, large-scale arrival of migrants, is no longer really rightly described as a crisis. It is an ongoing reality, and reality that will be ongoing for a long time. And so the needs that this ongoing large-scale migration generates should be attended to. They are predictable. The need for enhanced medical care, the need for enhanced educational opportunity, the need for shelter. These are all needs that governments should attend to, because it's far cheaper for them to do that than to spend time trying to deport communities who then will come back in another way. It's far more moral to do that, because it creates a kind of ethic of inclusion and humanity that many global North governments pride them on. And ultimately, it is more sustainable, because migration is not going to go away, and these communities are going to continue to face the challenges unassisted and potentially lead to devastating social and political disruption. So for these reasons, I would argue that empathic solidarity is something that should not be allowed to be exhausted or dissipated, as is currently the case. It is something that should be at the forefront of planning. It should be at the forefront of migration policy and advocacy. And we as migration advocates should also be advocates for the needs of these frontline host communities. So thank you. I think I'll leave it at that.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jackie. Next up, we have Sarah Dryden-Peterson. Sarah, it's yours.
Great, thanks so much. And it's just delightful to be part of this conversation today. I'm excited about the ideas you just presented, Jackie, and to think more about them together. I'm going to share some of our research on this topic from the lens of education. And the work that I'm going to talk about draws on research studies that span the last 2 decades and includes ethnographic research and more than 600 interviews in 23 countries with children, with their families, with teachers, those who are experiencing conflict and seeking refuge, and in many cases also the frontline host communities that Jackie is talking about as well. There we go. Oh. Okay, I wanted to start out with a framework to situate some of the work that we do in education. I find Uri Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems of human development that you see here as a useful framework to situate refugee education. I find that it allows us to situate individuals, like students, within multiple levels of interacting context. So the microsystem that we see at the center here is the context immediately around the individual, like families and peers. The mesosystem is the interactions among these microsystems. So for example, among children, families, schools, communities. The macro system is the thinking, systems of thinking, represented by laws, policies. They can be ways of thinking about race, about class, about belonging. And the chronosystem is the historical context that surrounds all of these systems. There are many ways in which these systems are relevant and interact in refugee education. I'm going to talk today about power that I see at the intersection of the chronosystem and the macro system. So about histories, geopolitics, policies that shape refugee education. About purpose at the intersection of the macro and mesosystems. So about the ways in which global and national policies interact with each other and shape education systems and structures. And also about pedagogies at the intersection of the meso and micro systems where school structures interact with teacher practices and the relationships students have with teachers, with peers, and with communities. First, I'm going to talk about power. Education of refugees challenges dominant models of the ways that education systems function and what young people learn, which generally, in most places, is concerned with the making of future citizens. Refugee education is concerned with the education of non-citizens, likely never citizens. So this makes refugee education somewhat of an extreme case, but also one that I find illuminates persistent tensions on the role of education in fostering unity, in thinking about diversity, and particularly on this dilemma of who belongs. In my historical analysis, I see power in refugee education shifting over time. Post-World War II was what I call the liberation phase of refugee education. This was during Cold War and independence struggles across Africa and Asia, where refugee education was really a community endeavor. Schools organized by refugee communities for refugee communities with the goal of preparing future leaders of future sovereign states. From about 1985, during what I call the standardization phase, global actors took responsibility, took power over refugee education in new ways, over the content of it and over funding of it. This was an era of the advent of large refugee camps, and UNHCR has been described at the time as acting as a kind of pseudo-state in that way. During the same standardization phase, we also saw movements towards what I call localization, real resistance against the standardization approaches that did not reflect refugees' realities or their purposes for education, shifting power back to local actors, in particular to teachers and students, and shifting what and how children learned. So for example, as it became clear that displacement in Dadaab camp in Kenya was protracted, was really a life course event for children, teachers in Dadaab in Kenya began to teach the Kenyan curriculum in the place where they were, to advocate for students to be able to sit for Kenyan national exams. They pushed against this conception of refugee education as a kind of holding ground until return to a country of origin was possible. The localization movement was really ad hoc and decentralized, but it led to another shift in where power lies in refugee education in the era that we're currently in, what I call the nationalization phase. Policy advocates right now inclusion of refugees into national schools. This inclusion approach is now used in most, but not all, refugee hosting states. But we also see that the model differs from country to country. And in particular, in a study of 14 countries, we found that this model really reflects the understood purposes of refugee education. So this brings us to the second P of purposes here. When I began my work in refugee education, the dominant global narrative was really that refugee education was temporary, was a kind of holding pattern until refugees could return to their country of origin. We know that these were not the purposes refugee communities had for education. focused instead on liberation and adapting standard emergency models to meet broader and more long-term visions through localization. While the purposes of refugee education in global rhetoric and analytic frames were once straightforwardly about the here and the now, our long-term work in many places reveals them to be much more complex. In particular, I find that refugees' experiences result in constant navigation of this triangle that you see on the slide, connecting histories to this dual imperative to live in the place where one is hosted from the very moment of arrival, a kind of placemaking process, while also connecting that placemaking to future building involving imagining and planning for multiple possible futures, here, there, or somewhere else entirely, usually processes that are not linear or static. But of course, as we're talking about today, there are also massive legal, policy, xenophobic constraints on refugees' access to resources and opportunities for connecting to histories, placemaking, and future building. In our work, we examine these kinds of opportunities through the lens of education. Leveraging the global scope of one of our studies across 14 refugee hosting countries, patterns emerged in the kinds of futures imagined for refugees at global and national levels by teachers, by policymakers, by refugees, and the kinds of education that resulted. A future of resettlement, a future of return, a future of integration, a future of transnationalism. And we found that how these futures are understood really shapes the kinds of schools refugees have access to, the content of what they learn, the languages in which they learn. We find that educational decisions and policies follow from which of these futures education is presumed to prepare young people for. So inclusion looks different depending on the future imagined. In South Africa and Rwanda, for example, where refugees have the right to work, refugees and nationals often attend school together at the same time in the same classrooms. In Kenya and Lebanon, the models of inclusion look quite different. These are places where refugees' political status and options for work are often tenuous and unpredictable. We find that then refugee students and national students attend national schools, but in separate places from each other. In the case of Kenya, isolated in camp settings, and in Lebanon in separate shifts, nationals in the morning, refugees in the afternoon, what I call geographic and temporal segregation in school spaces. In all of these contexts, we see what Jackie was describing as conditions for fragile solidarity with nationals. Refugee children attend schools in settings of marginalized nationals. So, for example, in Lebanon, refugees attend public schools where only 30% of nationals attend public schools. The kind of shift in approach during the nationalization phase, opening access to national schools for refugees, has marked a major opportunity for structural integration of refugees, addressing certain core dimensions of their educational marginalization. But my ongoing research has also demonstrated persistent dilemmas of relational integration that closely mirror the experiences of other marginalized children globally, including alienation from curriculum, exclusions and discrimination in relationships with teachers and peers, and lack of alignment between the promises of getting educated and the limited opportunities for equitable social, civic, economic, and political participation. A central dilemma for this kind of relational integration in refugee education is related to the daily experiences of teaching and learning. And this brings us to our third P, pedagogies. So I'd like to take a look now inside a classroom to see what these dilemmas look like. I'm going to use a set of animated drawings that come from our research just released last week as a short animated film. All of the quotes here you'll see are directly from our research participants in a study that included 8 months of ethnographic observation in schools and 100 hours of interviews. This is a second shift school in Lebanon, so meaning that Lebanese children attend school in the morning and Syrian children in the afternoon. They're in the same school with many of the same Lebanese teachers. One day, 2 Syrian students arrived to school to find the poster that they had made ripped up and torn to pieces on the floor. The students tried to talk to their teacher about what had happened here. By way of explanation, the teacher said that the students in the morning shift felt like Munir, the student, and his friends were intruders on the school. This idea, of course, made Munir even more upset, and he wanted to rip up, he said, all of their work. He said they should respect us the same way we respect them. It seemed only to make it worse when the principal told the class that maybe the students did this to the beautiful poster because, after all, it was their school first. Munir, upset as he was also resigned in some ways to this second-class status. As another student said, that did make some sense. They're Lebanese and their school is Lebanese. For sure, there's no country that favors others over their own citizens, right? In Syria, we also have our own school and it's not theirs. Munir explained how this felt to him. It's like they're giving us the school so we can learn, he said, but not to be established. He felt this way, even though he felt this way, he most often found these kinds of conversations closed for discussion, with his teachers saying things in response like, don't interfere with politics. We're here to study, not to talk about these issues. With this example in mind, I wanted to come back to this triangle. Refugees experience gaps in the ways in which education can connect histories, placemaking, and future building. But we do find that despite experiences like Munir's that are quite common, that students attribute major roles to their teachers in helping them to develop navigational capacities that support them making some of these connections. Though teachers often represent the state and often teach in ways that reinforce state interests and a rather exclusionary view of refugees, as Munir experienced, they also wield significant discretionary power within classrooms to support students based on care for students and knowledge of their present socio-political situations and also future aspirations. In this study in Lebanon, we've learned more about the specifics of what these pedagogies might look like from Syrian students. Students describe actions their teachers take to help them navigate these fixed and exclusionary structures and content of schooling, like the structural and social isolation in the second shift, and their alienation from curriculum that does not recognize their experiences. They tell us that teachers bridge these gaps through their ways of teaching and their ways of building relationships, what we call pedagogies of predictability, explaining, fairness, and care. Just in very brief, pedagogies of predictability involve a calm environment and clear expectations, explaining, answering questions, and making materials relevant, teaching the content that students need to pass the exams, but also not only helping them to catch up and not feel behind, but make sense of their experiences. Pedagogies of fairness involving supporting students to navigate the inequities that they experience, to talk about them, and recognize different needs, which might include translating when students don't understand. They value teachers who support them in making relevant some of the content that does feel exclusionary or doesn't recognize them. Pedagogies of care also involve teachers really getting to know students as individuals and getting to know their families, listening to their ideas and concerns, approaching them with kindness. As one student described, a teacher who didn't at all make us feel like we were entering a country that isn't ours. Some of our current work focuses on how these pedagogies might be learned by teachers and embedded within some of the larger educational structures that can feel so exclusionary. Thanks so much, and really looking forward to discussion.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Sarah. And it's great to see how your work lines up with Jackie's. And I see this is going to come out, I'm sure, during the Q&A. Next, I want to turn the microphone over to Melani Cammett. Melani, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen, if I can do that. Okay, just give me a minute. Here we go. Okay. Well, really delighted to be here on this panel and with this wonderful group of co-presenters. Thank you, Ted, for chairing and moderating. I'm going to share some research that I carried out with Aytu Shashmaz, who's a postdoctoral researcher at Stanford University. And I think it should complement the presentations we've heard thus far on this panel. And our focus is on the role of international actors, particularly international organizations, in service delivery during refugee crises. By the way, I take very seriously Jackie's earlier point about perhaps crisis is not the correct word here, in that we're dealing with very protracted situations. And refugees are displaced for, on average, I think it's something like 17 or 18 years globally. Sorry, I'm trying to go to the next slide. Okay, so we are focusing in this research on major humanitarian catastrophes, and in particular, the motivation for the project was the war, or is the war in Syria and its effects on neighboring countries. Our focus is on Lebanon. And as is well documented, many, but not all humanitarian crises are associated with a large-scale influx of aid from international organizations. Certainly the war in Syria generated this, particularly in surrounding countries. And so again, our focus is on how the involvement of international organizations affects the treatment of refugees in host countries. We know from an enormous body of research that seems to be growing by the day, particularly in political science, that there is a documented antipathy towards refugees by host country nationals. And certainly this is part of what's motivating the work that Jackie is doing in highlighting the importance of focusing on host countries. And there's evidence that this is not just the case for your quote unquote average citizen, but also people that are high income, highly educated, and are professionals. In our work, we're focusing on the medical sector, on primary healthcare, and on doctors in particular. And there is some evidence from existing public opinion surveys, and also from some of our own original data collection, that these negative feelings are present among educated professionals and doctors in particular as well. And so our focus is on the implications for behavior, that is, for the treatment of refugees in comparison with host country nationals in accessing local welfare services. And I emphasize this because a lot of the research thus far in my own discipline in political science focuses on attitudes. So we're trying to shift here a little bit more towards behavior, the actual treatment. And as I said, overwhelmingly research emphasizes antipathy towards refugees, but we also know from a growing body of work and from the comments of some of the panelists here today that empathy is possible as well. And this can be reflected arguably in treatment, in behavior towards refugees. This might be for a variety of motivations. It might have to do with what social psychologists call intrinsic motivations, such as altruism or commitment to professional ethics, like the Hippocratic Oath, for example, on the part of doctors. It might also arise for more selfish motivations having to do with access to financial resources or strategic motivations, or exactly the kinds of things Jackie was talking about earlier in the kind of selfish dimensions of charity. So let me just preview our arguments. I'm not going to go into great detail on what exactly we did in the study. I'll just sort of describe in a kind of 30,000 foot picture. And if anyone's interested, there is a working paper based on an earlier version of this project that we've circulated at the Program on Governance and Local Development at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. And we also have a more recent version as well for resubmission to a journal. So again, as I said, our focus is on the quality of primary healthcare in Lebanon for refugees versus nationals. And to cut to the chase, our main result is that we find equitable treatment of Syrian refugees in their experiences accessing primary healthcare. I'll talk about how we measure that in a moment. And we try to dig into what's going on here. And our main explanation is what we call the IO effect, the effect of international organizations, because we find evidence that those centers, those healthcare centers that have contracts with international organizations such as the UNHCR, are what's pulling up the average in the treatment of Syrian refugees by doctors in these health centers in Lebanon. And I should mention that all of these health centers are run by Lebanese organizations. The question is whether they have funds from contracts with international organizations. And so what's the logic of the IO effect, as we call it? Well, we think of it as a kind of extrinsic motivation that operates both at the organizational level and at the individual level. So organizationally, it's very much in the interests of the provider organization to maintain a positive relationship with international organizations, which are an important source of resources and contracts and so forth. And then at the individual level, there are incentives to work in places with contracts with international organizations because perhaps, salary related, benefits related, status, that sort of thing. And this taps into an existing body of research on humanitarianism related to what people have called internal brain drain. So educated professionals tend to gravitate towards working for organizations that are linked to international groups rather than local organizations. So what's the data that we're working with that we base these conclusions on? We ran an original study. I won't bore you with all the details here, but happy to talk more in the Q&A or share the paper. We ran an original study in 2017. Okay, so this is not at the current really severe moment of crisis with converging crises hitting Lebanon. This is at an earlier period, about 3-4 years ago. And we have a representative sample of 69 primary healthcare centers in Lebanon. And in those 69 centers, we had trained a team of enumerators, really excellent group of graduate students from Lebanon who went and conducted surveys with about 200 doctors, about 1,200 patients during exit interviews. They carried out observations of medical examinations and carried out additional surveys with the chief medical officers and administrators in these centers. And all of these forms of data are linked. So you can trace, anonymized linked, which patients saw which doctors, which medical exams, and so forth. And then we did follow-up interviews with a random sample of doctors in 15 of these centers, and again, matched across patients. Now, you might be thinking, if you're a social scientist, well, how can you draw any conclusions from this if you haven't randomly assigned patients to centers? This was just ethically and logistically not possible to assign patients randomly to centers to measure the quality of care for a variety of reasons that are probably obvious, but I'd be happy to talk about. And so what do we do in this study? Well, we look at our outcome variable is the quality of care, which I'll talk about in a moment, that Syrian refugees received in comparison with Lebanese nationals. And we carry out various statistical analyses with the data we've collected to determine the quality of care on average for these different patient population groups. And then we carry out additional analyses with our quantitative data and qualitative data to figure out what's going on, why Syrians received the level of care that they did on average, and find evidence for an interaction effect between being a Syrian patient being served in an organization partnered with international organizations, suggesting that there's something going on at the level of centers that have partnerships with international organizations that's bringing up the quality of care. And so then we look at, what are the factors that might explain this? What distinguishes doctors that are working in these centers affiliated with international organizations? Okay, so let me just say very briefly, without going into too much detail, how we're measuring the quality of care. And we didn't invent this. This is a widely used set of measures that we borrowed from the work of Jishnu Das and his collaborators at the World Bank. That is what he calls the Doctor Effort Index. And it's a composite index based on what is called process quality. That is how the doctors interact with patients, how many questions they ask them, how many exams they undertook, how much time they spent with patients. And this is important because, as Das and others have argued, it's really doctor effort that distinguishes the quality of care. You can have like the best infrastructure and resources, but if you don't have doctors that are exerting effort, you can't deliver good quality care. So this is a really critical measure of the quality of care. We do control for all kinds of other things like resources and equipment and so forth. And then we have a bunch of other control variables that might be popping into your head. Well, could it be, that Syrians are sicker on average and require more attention? Or, are there other factors that might be driving this, demographic and so forth? So we try to control for a bunch of these things that might affect the outcome. And again, as I said, we find that on average, Syrian refugees receive approximately equal care as Lebanese nationals. And in fact, in some places, we find that doctors may exert more effort in treating Syrian patients, which then brings up, sort of equalizes the average. And then we try to probe what's going on with various measures based on the surveys with doctors and related data. And based on the measures that we've collected, we don't find evidence that it's, sort of reported altruism or commitment to professional ethics or various financial incentives at how they're compensated at the level of the center that drives these results, that differentiates doctors serving Syrians and not serving Syrians and so forth. So what is this IO effect that we're talking about, the international organization effect? Well, there are a lot, if you're familiar with the case of Lebanon, and this is true for a number of other countries that have faced conflict and humanitarian crises, there's a lot of international organizations operating in Lebanon. And a couple of years into the start, the real spread of refugees across borders after the outbreak of the Syrian war, the Lebanese government, in partnership with a number of international organizations, developed this crisis response plan. And then there were various partnerships established with pre-existing local Lebanese health centers that gave these centers access to subsidies, guidance on medical practice, provision of equipment, and so forth. So these are what we call the IO partnered centers. And so we look at whether these centers deliver better care to Syrians. And as I've previewed already, we do find evidence from our analyses that these centers are the ones that are bringing up the quality of care for Syrian refugees. And there are real substantive effects here in terms of our measures of doctor effort. More questions are asked, more exams are carried out, more time is spent. These might look like really small extra portions of effort, but they're actually meaningful if you look at the baseline. And we don't find a difference in centers that don't have partnerships with international organizations. So then we start digging into what's going on here. What distinguishes doctors who are in partnered centers with international organizations? Do they have better attitudes towards Syrians? And we have an experimental component of our survey that tries to tap into that. Do they express more altruistic attitudes? Do they have a greater commitment to professional ethics? We don't find evidence for that, but we do find evidence for higher levels of reported job satisfaction on the part of these doctors working in centers with international organizations, which is consistent with the arguments that we've made about how the IO effect works. And so I just want to share a few insights from the qualitative data that we collected with these interviews with doctors. And one of our researchers from our data collection team carried these out in 2018. And so one of our doctors noted that centers that work with a lot of Syrian patients really benefited, they prospered, and that helped the center as a whole, and that's helping to drive more patients there. Then we we also have another doctor saying that, doctors took advantage of this situation. The period of displacement, of refugee influx really helped primary care centers. They got more equipment, they got to hire more doctors. So it was very motivating for the centers to experience this. And then likewise, when the international organization stopped helping primary healthcare centers, when the crisis started to abate a little and some of these centers no longer had contracts with IOs, then the level of care dropped, according to one of the interviewees. So there was a fair amount of evidence that brought this up rather unprompted, actually, in these follow-up interviews. And so that raises questions about whether there were certain motivations that would be consistent with what we've categorized as extrinsic motivations at work here. So let me just wrap up with a few comments about, what the implications are of this study. And I first want to emphasize that, the takeaway message should not be that doctors are selfish and are not altruistic and don't respect professional ethics. That's not true at all. We're talking about average effects and what's distinguishing doctors that, are working with in these partnered centers or not. So certainly, doctors in our sample, there's no reason to think they're not altruistic and behave according to professional ethics on average, but there's something else going on here. And we find some evidence that suggests that at least during the humanitarian crisis situation, at the height of it, international organizations may improve the overall treatment of refugees, which, if you're familiar with the literature on humanitarianism, the politics of humanitarianism and international organizations, this is not what everybody says. So we're wading into these debates. They provide vital resources for addressing crises. They are, potentially provide resources for future crises on an ongoing basis. And certainly they're an important employer for educated professionals. And we've, got evidence that people like these jobs. And there's a whole literature, as I mentioned, that suggests that there's attractive things about having jobs in organizations, international organizations, and those that have contracts with international organizations. There are, of course, downsides to this, and I already mentioned the term internal brain drain. This is a phenomenon that economists and others have theorized that suggests that the presence of international organizations can lead to this sort of drawing of educated professionals out of local institutions, out of the public sector in developing countries and into international organizations that can sort of create a human capital problem for the host country. Also, it's well documented that international organizations don't stay forever. They tend to be associated with crisis moments. And so this is not a sustainable model for providing care well into the future. And I think this last point relates to things that Jackie was highlighting in particular, and some of Sarah's points, that this is a real issue in host countries, that there is a perception, warranted or not, that refugees get favorable treatment, particularly with the influx of international organizations flooding in to address the crisis. And this can be a recipe for breeding further antipathy among host country nationals towards refugees. And for this reason, I think a number of international organizations have become increasingly cognizant of this and have tried to introduce programs that also serve host country nationals. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Melanie. That was fascinating. And all of these presentations have sparked a number of questions for me that I'm holding in until the Q&A period, but I want to encourage our audience to submit questions in the Q&A tab down at the bottom of your screen. We'll be able to pass those among the panelists and formulate some discussion patterns for after our final presenter speaks. And our final presenter is, in fact, here with us. It is Rula Amin from the UNHCR. Rula, it's great to have you here, and thank you so much for joining us. Oh, and you're muted.
Okay. Thank you very much, and many apologies for the delay. We had a little emergency here. So good evening, and thank you for this opportunity to discuss such a pressing issue. It's pressing as there are more than 82 million people who are displaced from their homes as we speak. And the displacement pace is unprecedented. In the past few years, the number has doubled within only 10 years globally. So I had promised that I will try to give a bird's eye view, but from the ground, on all the interventions that took place. And I'll start with the last intervention, because that's exactly one area where the humanitarian agencies, including UNHCR, had actually tried to build on that concept of the IO concept. And so for the Syria crisis, which has caused the largest displacement globally, they have created this, what's called the 3RP. And the 3RP is a regional plan by the humanitarian actors. It's a strategic for coordination, planning, advocacy, fundraising, and programming for humanitarian and development partners. It was meant to respond to the Syria crisis, and it compromises one regional plan with 5 standalone country chapters covering Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, and Egypt. And the main thing about it is that not only it coordinates the response to the needs of the Syrian refugees who are spread and who are hosted in these 5 countries, but it also dedicates a lot of resources to assist the hosting communities, the hosting government, to actually carry this burden and be able to provide and support and continue to host this large population of refugees. Out of Syria, there are out of the whole population of Syria, more than half had been displaced. And until this day, there's 6.7 million who are still inside Syria. In the 5 neighboring countries, 5.5 million, more than 5.5 million Syrians are hosted in Iraq, Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and Egypt. Out of more than 6 million. So this gives you an idea on the effort that these hosting government have to put in order not only to host this large population in the first years of the crisis, but now it's been more than 10 years. So it's good to hear acknowledgement of the work that had been done through this plan in order to encourage, not only meet the refugees' need and protect their asylum space, but also to help the communities around them and foster peace building, foster social cohesion, which was very important. But I'm afraid it's an uphill battle. Despite all these resources, for 2021, the plan actually envisions about needs that require about more than $5 billion. It's less than it's about 20% funded. This means that even with the utmost of best intentions, the plan still is not meeting all the needs. And despite all the interventions that target the host communities, we are still battling with some anti-refugee sentiments. But we have to look at the bigger context, because if you look at a place like Lebanon, which is a very small country, but it's hosting the largest refugee population in the world per capita. Turkey is hosting the largest refugee population, period, because they are hosting 3.5 million Syrian refugees, in addition to other refugees from other countries. So I would like to touch on some of the challenges that organizations like UNHCR face as they try to battle these anti-refugee sentiments, xenophobia, discrimination, all these different negative feelings that the main issue is that they can be translated into actions that actually infringe and undermine the refugee protection, violate their human rights, and deprive them from specific services. So what are the challenges? And I'm not going to dwell only on the challenges, but I'll also speak of opportunities, because we have seen some opportunities and some of the work did bring excellent results. But one of the main challenges is that most of the refugees in the world, more than 80%, are hosted in middle or low income countries, which means that the hosting governments and the hosting countries are having their own challenges. High unemployment, very weak infrastructure, very weak public services, not many resources in order to be able to host all these populations. The lack of resources and the competition over these resources, plus deep political tensions in many of these countries, have meant that even when the interventions that the humanitarian agencies actually introduce in order to foster this peace building and social cohesion, they're undermined. If you take the example of Lebanon, there's a lot of resources that had been put to support the Lebanese government and the Lebanese people as they host this largest population per capita. However, when you talk to Lebanese, the perception is that the refugees are a huge burden, and they blame them for a lot of the economic woes in the country, in addition to some of the political problems. And as much as UNHCR tries and other actors will try to fight this, it is actually very difficult, because when you have political, deep political divisions, it's very easy to use the refugee issue in order to mobilize the public and supporters and followers on an issue that seems easy. It's very hard also to battle these perceptions when there are historical and cultural heritages and legacies. And so even when you look at an individual who may be supported by these interventions that the humanitarians are introducing, there are other factors that play into the mindset where it becomes little compared to other considerations and mobilizations and manipulation that some of the host countries, and I'm not talking just about Lebanon, but in general, are going through. One major issue as well is that sometimes refugees it's the perception of what a refugee is. And that's part of the alternative narrative that usually UNHCR tries very hard in order to disseminate and have it sink in, which is that refugees are not only recipients. You know, part of UNHCR's mandate is not only to protect and provide humanitarian assistance, but also to find durable solutions. And durable solutions could be returned to the country of origin, which many times takes years. Another solution is inclusion in the services, in the overall system of the hosting countries. But when refugees are hosted in low-income countries and middle-income countries, that becomes really a challenge. Even talking about it becomes a serious challenge. And we have to go and maneuver about it and tiptoe as we try to introduce this concept. It's very hard to tell people refugees need to be allowed to work when the nationals are struggling to find jobs. It's very difficult to say that refugees have the right to have access to the health services and education when the host communities are suffering. So that's a major challenge that we have been trying to work. What we are saying is, and we try, is that refugees are not only recipients, but they are potential great contributors. We should not look at refugees as just recipients of aid. They have a lot of potential. They come up with a lot of skills, and they can contribute to the communities that host them. Now, it takes a lot for this logic and for this narrative to be accepted. Part of the devices and we use is we partner with local NGOs, local human rights organizations, activists who may be better equipped to come up with this than the aid agencies. The other point that is very important is that refugees, it's not just it's not charity to provide assistance, but refugees have rights. And this again is a very sensitive issue when you're talking about refugees hosted in very complicated situations. Then you have what we call myths, and we try to dispel these myths. We call myth busters. For example, when the crisis in Afghanistan started unfolding, a lot of the discussion publicly and in the media was focused on any potential movement by Afghan refugees towards Europe. Although more than 80% of Afghan refugees are hosted in Pakistan and Iran throughout the past 20 years. But sometimes these facts they drop. And no matter how much you keep on reiterating these facts, they drop because there are other considerations and there are other factors that we need to address. In Lebanon, for another example, because since there's a lot of discussion on Syria and Lebanon, the assistance that refugees are getting they get it in the Lebanese pound, Lebanese lira. And in the past, that was fine because it was stable. But in the past 2 years, we saw a significant devaluation and a drop in the value of the Lebanese lira. But we still cannot give refugees this assistance in dollars. However, every Lebanese you talk to will tell you that refugees are getting assistance in dollars while they're not getting anything. So it's not black and white. It's not a very easy task. But there are opportunities. And some of these opportunities have evolved I'll just mention at least 3 of them. One is COVID. And COVID proved to be a challenge, but also an opportunity. A challenge because it actually had a very devastating economic impact on the hosting countries and on refugees, on their livelihoods, access to services, education, dropout rates. All these gains that the humanitarian actors had been able to bring to refugee populations in different hosting countries are now under threat. However, COVID as well kind of had trenched the idea that we are all in the same boat, that walls and borders and measures to keep people out don't necessarily protect the countries and populations. And this has given us an opportunity because we can see that, for example, when it comes to vaccination, we did not see resistance to refugees getting the vaccine, even in countries where the vaccines were not available in high numbers, and they were still prioritized. In Jordan, for example, when the country first got the vaccines, there was a limited number of vaccines available and it was prioritized, and refugees were included. They were included when it was given to the elderly, they were included when it was given to the sick people and people with vulnerabilities. And we did not hear any kind of criticism to the government or any resistance from the Jordanian public to the fact that refugees may be taking this vaccine while a 30-year-old Jordanian was not able to get it at all. And I think that's partly because there was this realization that refugees are part of the community, and if they're not vaccinated, it will affect everybody and it will actually undermine the whole effort to combat COVID-19. Another opportunity is Black Lives Matter and the Me Too campaigns, because it has brought momentum to activism. It has brought momentum to the concept of caring about issues and doing something about it, even if it's not in our own backyard, and even if it doesn't pose a specific direct threat to us or to our communities. And we see many examples on how this momentum had actually translated into specific actions. We have been seeing an increase in the willingness of the private sector and private donors to contribute to help with the response to refugee crisis. An example that we just had over the weekend here, we had a YouTuber. He's a Somali YouTuber based in Kuwait, and he's a content creator. And he wanted to mark reaching 20 million followers with a fundraiser to help refugees and IDPs, internally displaced people, in the MENA region during the winter. So he promised that he's going to live stream until he's able to fundraise $1 million. And he actually did it in 28 hours. It was really incredible to watch, but it's this 23-year-old young man. He was motivated. He wanted to help in. More than 30,000 people took part in this fundraising, some with huge amounts and some with very little amount. But it shows that we have a window of opportunity where, maybe there is more empathy that could be translated into actions of support, whether it's fundraising or supporting refugee causes. But again, these are opportunities that we need to build on before the momentum actually disappears. And this is one of the avenues that UNHCR had been pursuing, which is how to build on people's willingness, individuals, private sector, businesses, NGOs, local entities, to get them on the wagon, to help us not only protect refugees and their rights, but also to make sure that they are given a chance to live in dignity. And I think that's something very important to keep on talking, to keep on highlighting, because it's something that is very critical. And we say we don't want to support refugees just to survive, but also to thrive. And this requires a lot of collaboration from hosting communities, from actors, whether it's donor countries, from whether it's big businesses, or even resettlement countries. And I think this is one of the main points that we try to make as we try to make this refugee issue, as we say, we want shared responsibility, and we want a global response to meet the needs of refugees, protect them, protect their rights, and make it rights-based. I think what I'll finish with one point, is that here refugees have rights that were granted by international law. And this is something that other actors, not just the aid actors, is something that we need them to emphasize. And it helps because it does take away refugees as well from that perception that they are weak, they are helpless, they're dependent on aid, and they are not able to do anything else. And it's also that it's optional to support or not to support, to receive them or not to receive them. So the last thing is to hold people accountable. And that's a major point when we try to find anti-refugee sentiments, when we try to combat xenophobia, when we try to prevent anti-refugee sentiment from translating into actions that actually will hinge on refugees' rights and their ability to thrive and to have a future for their children, and to have hope that there will be an end to the stalemate, that there will be an end to their displacement, that there will be some kind of a durable solution. But that will require, as I said, a lot of not just advocacy, but people contributing to this advocacy and adopting it. And I think I'll stop here. It's 7:10, so we'll leave some time for questions.
Great, thank you so much, Rula. This has just been a wonderful series of presentations, and I love it when the content of the presenters hangs together so beautifully. So thank you all for making it happen. There are some great questions in the Q&A, and while our panelists take a look at what they might pick and choose to talk about, I want to take the moderator's prerogative and ask a question about training for frontline hosts, for frontline teachers, for frontline healthcare providers and workers. What sorts of, you're talking about people who already are trained to some extent, but how much additional training do people get in the, the special circumstances in dealing with refugees in these schools and healthcare centers and camps and other types of organizations that support them? And I'll go ahead if everybody wants to take off their microphones and go ahead and freewheel a little bit. Rula, you look like you're ready to go. Go ahead.
A quick comment. Training actually makes a big difference because it, you train people and you, I don't want to say attack, but you basically target the basic concept that would actually hinder any kind of positive interaction and commitment to servicing the refugees and supporting them. However, training, we have to understand, it's actually challenging because most refugees are not living in confined areas. Most refugees, more than 90% of refugees, are living in cities. They're not living in camps, although the perception is that refugees are in camps, and so you train 200, 300 social workers or humanitarians, and that would help you. But they are all around urban areas. So it means you need a lot of training, and you have to target your trainings, whether it's border police, it's people managing registration, people managing borders, health services, education, and key influentials. We are finding it that key influentials are really can be a very good resource that can really advance agendas and goals.
Great, thank you. Sarah, did you want to jump in on that topic?
Sure, I'm happy to talk a little bit about schools this way, because I think it connects to some of the broader themes that each of us have been talking about as well. I mean, like you're saying, Rula, I think we find that teachers of refugees receive so little of the training that they deeply are looking for every day in their work. And then confront situations in which they simply don't know how to respond. And so working with children who have experienced trauma, trying to think about how to teach history when there are so many conflicts embedded in it and not sure what a discussion might look like, and fearing what the kind of political backlash might be for teachers who are, for the most part, civil servants, and also fear for their jobs in that way. I think one of the things that each of us have touched on somewhat is that in many cases, refugees are living among and within communities of nationals who are very similarly marginalized. They may have a different legal status, but what we find in schools is that many of the same Lebanese teachers who are teaching Lebanese students and Syrian students struggle to address the needs of their Lebanese students in the same way, given conditions of poverty and lack of access to resources. And so it makes me wonder, across all of our kind of talks, what it would mean to support the kind of development in education, for example, needs of both nationals and refugees simultaneously, with a longer vision for what the engagement of international organizations looks like, or this empathetic solidarity that persists through time. But with the prerequisite of recognizing that the marginalization refugees are facing is in fact not unique in the particular situations that they're living in.
Great, thank you. I'm going to turn to Melani or Jackie. Did you want to take on the training? No, okay. Then I'm going to move on to a next question, and I see that they're popping into the Q&A much more. And I want to go to the question that Annette has posed in the Q&A about empathetic solidarity, and whether or not there is much variation in empathetic solidarity in developed countries versus the hosting communities, or the frontline hosting communities in developing countries. And that's something that I'll leave out there. Jackie, it seems like you're logically the first person to take this one on, but I have a feeling others may have some thoughts as well.
Yeah, thank you, Ted, and thank you, Annette, for that question. So we are just embarking on our data collection. So I haven't actually got findings I can share with you yet, but just impressionistically from the work we've been doing over the last 5 years or so in the field, I can say that you see evidence of this empathic solidarity and its dissipation in places as different as, you know, villages neighboring Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, Lesbos in Greece, places along the caravan in Mexico, in Istanbul in Turkey. So this process whereby kind of, you know, outpourings of generosity and solidarity and an identification with refugee needs, and actually a sense of enrichment from the refugee presence. This process where this then progressively over time, with failures of resettlement and failures in investment and mixed messages and false promises, this kind of dissipation, I think, is not particular to one area. Clearly, there are some outliers. There are some places, I would suppose, like you could say some of the East European countries, where for a range of reasons, which I think are kind of interesting to scrutinize, there's a very well articulated xenophobic anti-migrant constituency, which was kind of up and running early on. And conversely, there are other places, and you know, places like Berlin spring to mind, where there's a very well coordinated and a very robust inclusive community, where actually we haven't seen great rises in xenophobia. So of course there are outliers, but when you talk about kind of local people who do not identify as humanitarians and as professionals, as as even, you know, see themselves as human rights activists, but are just ordinary people doing that, going about their daily business. I think you see this very similar process, you know, from and even similar behavior. I mean, like, you know, the collection of clothes, you know, it's common to Virginia now with Afghans. It was evident in Lesbos, you know, in the peak of the summer. People do these things because they all know what it is to have a cold baby. They all know what it is to have a, you know, an elderly relative who's hungry. So I don't think there are dramatic regional differences that we have seen. But once we have our studies in, we may have a better answer.
I'd like to add to that. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, you go first.
Go ahead, Rula, and then we'll go to Melani. Yeah, thanks.
Is that in developed countries where refugees are resettled, they are getting their rights and their services, and they're entitled to, because they become citizens, and the law and the system grants them these. They don't need specific, the local community's approval to be able to go to the school, because it's in the system. They have rights to education, they have the right to access to the health services. And while in hosting countries that are underdeveloped and having huge economic challenges, I'll give you an example, post-COVID. And because of, you know, COVID has pushed a lot of refugees and hosting communities under the poverty line. So many people had to remove their kids from private school and take them to public schools. But that meant the public schools became too crowded. And we have seen instances where the parents came and said the priority is for us because we cannot afford to send our kids to private schools. We need this. And so the refugees are more, their access to services and their rights is more hinged on this empathy and solidarity. And it actually matters more because it can easily tip from sentiments to actions that actually will affect them directly and instantly and in major ways, like the access to services and health and education and work.
Thank you. Melani, did you have a comment?
Yeah, so I wanted to get to this point that you raised, that Annette raised, about the differences in attitudes and host communities in Western developed countries versus developing countries. And there's actually, in the political science literature, there's been a turn towards addressing this question, because the sort of baseline finding based on studies of Western Europe in particular is that there's widespread antipathy towards refugees, and that a lot of it is rooted in cultural factors, and even more than economic factors. Whereas in one study that came out, for example, last year in the journal Comparative Political Studies, based on a survey in Jordan, suggested that there's actually much more empathy towards refugees than we find in the literature based on Western European contexts. Now, which I think is a really important point, and they speculate that this is due to more shared cultural identity and values that are arising. You know, the refugees are flowing across borders and sometimes from the same tribal origins and so forth. I wonder if this might be specific to the Jordanian context, because the context in Lebanon is really different. And of course, now it's, you know, tragic with the convergence of multiple catastrophes, you know, financial crisis, explosion, electricity going on in Lebanon. I mean, it would be just heroic for people to open their arms and say, welcome refugees now, when their lives are falling apart in front of them. So I do think there's some contextual specificity. And of course, most of these studies are based on public opinion surveys based on one-shot data collection. And so these attitudes can change over time. But I do think that's an important point, that we're dealing with a very different relationship when refugees spill over across a border with shared cultural backgrounds and so forth. And one little thing I would add, based on our own study, we have some suggestive evidence that even among educated professionals, there is antipathy. There are negative attitudes. There are attitudes that expressed about the hygiene of refugees and related issues that in the American public health literature are associated with racist sentiments, like refugees are dirty, they're vectors of disease, that sort of thing. But that doesn't seem to affect behavior or treatment. So there's, you can have negative antipathy, but equal or fair treatment of people. And that's a finding that we see in other research in the social sciences on intergroup relations, that people can have negative attitudes towards people from other ethnic groups, but they can still be nice to them. So worth mentioning.
Ted, I wonder if I could just, jump in for a second.
Absolutely, Jackie. Yeah, what a provocative
No, I just
thing.
realized,
Yeah.
particularly in response to Annette, that we haven't mentioned Venezuelans and Latin America at all, which is actually a huge omission on our part. And of course, there is, it's interesting because I suppose in relation to what Melani just said, there are a lot of cultural affinities, for example, between Venezuelans and Colombians, and indeed an enormous sense of gratitude for past hospitality. But again, there's a lot of evidence now coming out of Colombia that there are changes in attitudes from Colombians, and COVID has exacerbated that. So, in a way, this sense of the threat of the other, particularly in the midst of a pandemic, has really, that has actually been used to kind of demonize Venezuelans. And I think the same has been true in some Mexican communities with Central Americans and others. So I think, I think there are a lot of specificities here, but these overall trends are pretty common, I think, across different regions, as far as I can see.
If may add, there's the cultural element, but there's also the political. And the difference between Jordan and Lebanon is that when the wave of Syrian refugees started arriving, the political leadership in Jordan and most of the population was very much pro-revolution, anti-protesters, anti-Syrian authorities. While in Lebanon, the population is divided along those lines. So there are some who are with and some who are without. And this political affiliation actually affects people's attitudes more. I feel that in this context, it may have played a bigger role than even the culture affinity, the political affinity, and how they perceive these people from that crisis and conflict that they feel is very close to them and they have very strong views on.
Great. Any other comments on Annette's point about the? Okay.
I can, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, Sarah. Yeah, please.
Well, I was just going to bring in one thing, which I think that across both in the US and Canada, in countries like Uganda and Kenya, where we've also done work in Lebanon, one of the things that we hear over and over again from young people and also from teachers is just how rarely they actually have contact or conversations across lines of refugee and national. And this is not necessarily always true for parents, and certainly there are economic places in which people may find themselves together. But even under these inclusion models, and Rula, I think it's so important to think about just what you were talking about, how challenging it is, the political narrative of inclusion. But even in situations where there is inclusion on paper, most refugees in Uganda don't interact with any Ugandan nationals over the course of months. The Lebanese students who we talk to and the Syrian students who we talk to, there's actually like a break between the morning shift and the afternoon shift, so the children never cross each other and don't have the chance to build these kind of relationships. And we see the same thing in the US because of such severe lines of segregation in schools. Even though refugees have access to schools, there are often real different neighborhoods, different school districts where kids who have arrived from another country or longtime residents go to school. And I think these are important dimensions that we continue to think about as we look at what the possibilities are for the development of some of these different narratives or empathetic solidarity, like you were talking about, Jackie.
Great, thank you. I want to turn now to a theme that was woven through several of the questions, and that is the relationship between international actors, whether it's the UN and NGOs, and the interaction between those actors and states, and what is how does this happen? Does this impact service provision? Does it impact quality of experience? Does it impact empathetic behaviors and feelings? And I just want to open up the role of the state versus the role of international actors that you have all referenced. Let's see, who wants to go first? Okay, Melani, you want to take a stab at that one?
Well, the one thing I would say, and I think a lot of people have made this point in research on international organizations and humanitarianism, is that we have to be really careful with the idea of sort of having IOs take over jobs that states could and normatively should do for a variety of reasons, including how this might affect people's connections to the national political community, to their country, to the state, and so forth. So to the extent that service delivery and other programs that address refugee needs are delivered or supported by international organizations, it's best if they're done in collaboration with local actors, and that the credit claiming, the politics of credit claiming, goes to local actors in particular. So I think this is a really sensitive point, that even if international organizations are quite important for response to humanitarian disasters and related issues, that the state be integrally involved. I mean, it's tough when you have a state that's falling apart and that isn't controlled by a single entity. I think many of you know what country I'm thinking of, but that's not sort of the modal case in many countries globally. Mm-hmm.
Thanks. Rula, go ahead. Sure.
That's a very important point, and for UNHCR and even the other UN agencies here, this is exactly what we are working towards, is where we become like almost facilitators for the support that comes. So it doesn't just come as for humanitarian agencies, and when it's translated into assistance that reach refugees, it's actually investment in the national systems, so that refugees can have access to these national systems, whether it's health, education, infrastructure, water, sanitation. And that way, it's more efficient because you're helping the host community and the refugees. It's longer term, it's sustainable, and it will have a long-term impact because it will help the development of these host communities. Of course, it is very tricky because you have to have transparency and you have to have these systems ready to be able to receive these funds and support, and at the same time include refugees, because if the refugees are not included, and that which requires also some kind of consent from the society that they are on equal footing. So it's like a tricky equation, but on the long term, that's the path we're heading towards.
Great. Anyone else want to take on the Jackie? Yeah, go ahead.
I can see we're running out of time. So I just wanted to make one point in kind of really in conversation with Melani about IOs and states, and go back to a point that Melani made in her presentation about the kind of perception that that international organizations, the negative perception. My sense is that it's a kind of a dual perception of the role of international organizations in the refugee context. That on the one hand, yes, you talked about the negative brain drain. I think one also knows about increase in rents and the kind of really unbalancing of local economies due to this massive influx of funding. On the other hand, I think while humanitarians are in place, they certainly do provide a kind of positive, just as your research shows, a positive impact, and they do provide a kind of complementary role to government. So I think it's both, and I think it isn't either or. So the challenge is really sustaining that intervention in a way that it doesn't kind of harm local communities in the medium and long term, and that's what often doesn't happen, I think. So yeah.
Mindful of the time, Sarah, do you want to have the last word on this topic, and then we'll bring it to a close?
Just one additional thought to contribute here. I think that what we see in schools, coming back to this kind of like training that is offered, on a very micro level, what that means for state institutions, like teacher training colleges, for example, to interact with teachers of refugees who may be nationals or maybe refugees, and with very different political ideas of what the purposes of education might be. And I think that for me, these very micro level daily interactions of sorting out kind of what is it, what's our purpose here, what are we trying to accomplish, and how can we think about opening up opportunities for all in those ways become an important way forward in the context, of course, of all the kinds of structural elements that surround that. So I'm invigorated by all the ideas that the panelists have shared today and excited about ways forward.
Fabulous. Thank you. Well, I'm invigorated too, because the title Empathy and Xenophobia, you know, it could have gone either way, but this was definitely a panel focused on the empathetic side of things, which is a hopeful way to have the conversation conclude and to move forward. So I want to thank our panelists for their terrific participation, and I look forward to reading papers and articles that come out of this. And thank you to the audience for sticking with us. Thank you. Good night.